why don't you start us off with some opening thoughts on the Magician card in general, its portrayal in Marseille, and maybe how you read the Magician in the Marseille lineage.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so I'm pretty excited about this because the Magician is one of my favorite cards, and also one that I think really offers a key into understanding the tarot more broadly. And we talked last time about the Fool, which in most traditions and in most decks is numbered as 0. We talked a little bit last time about how in the Marseille deck that's not the case. It just doesn't have a number at all. But in all the decks, the Magician is number 1. And kind of in the traditions that have been the most influential to how I interact with tarot, the Magician is actually where we start. So I look at the Magician as a nice entry point. There's a relationship between the archetype of the Fool and the relationship of the archetype of the Magician. They're both of the same kind of character of these traveling figures, these jugglers that we talked about. But whereas the Fool kind of represents freedom and creativity, the Magician is sort of a different spin on a related topic. It's less about the freedom of creativity, but then the organization and bringing back together of creativity. And the Magician, to me, is sort of like the key to unlocking all of the rest of the tarot, both the major and the minor arcana. We can get into the symbolism a little bit more, but he has these items on his table that kind of represent different aspects of the tarot and of the elements, and he kind of takes a little bit from everywhere in the tarot. And the one thing I think is really helpful in the way that I think about Marseille tarot and how I think about the tarot in general, there's a quote from, I always come back to Valentin Tomberg, he's just the GOAT from Meditations of the Tarot, who said, he kind of gave, in his thoughts about the Magician, he says that he is or the tarot in general can be thought of as these little enzymes that cause a ferment. So you take the symbol, you interact with it, and then it processes some sort of change within you. And the Magician is really like the best symbol of how that process works and how it's demonstrated. And so the Magician is where that process happens, and there's a way in which he approaches this. He's very, it's light, it's entertaining, it's for our fun, but it's also serious. There's all this work and effort that's gone into it to make it be the pleasurable experience that you can have from it. And so that's how I think about the Magician.
Alyssa, what are your thoughts?
I was going to start by talking about how I view the Magician as the sort of prime alchemist in the tarot deck. And I liked how in the comments, Loie, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right, said tarot as alchemy. And we really see the kind of alchemist at work in the Rider-Waite deck. Obviously, there's this kind of transition from the fundamental archetype in the Marseille, kind of showing all the tools that are at the disposal. But when you add in the kind of golden dawn layers of occultism, the spiritual depths with alchemy, you start to see these dynamics at play. So what does it really mean when this card comes forward? Often to me, it's like this awakening of consciousness. To me, the Fool is more of this primal archetype that hasn't really formed sort of solid structures and foundations. It's very instinctual, it's very primordial. But as we take that first step into the major arcana, suddenly all of these energies start to awaken. And as an individual, we realize that we can be these conduits to channel inspiration, instinct, potential through us. And so you have that kind of alchemical maxim, as above, so below. If I can sort of sense the potentials in the heavens, it can move through me and be grounded into the material. So the Rider-Waite magician is that alchemist with all of the minor arcana tools on his table, meaning the ability for him to manipulate and work with these different skill sets is now at his fingertips. So there is awareness, there's development, there's the ability for a more concentrated action, and that power to create kind of starts to make you like the master of your own destiny, as if you could sort of shift reality and bend it to your will. The magician, to me, is this really powerful invitation to step into your power in a very different way than the chariot. It's a much more internalized, subtle ways that we can learn to work with our own thoughts or emotions or inspirations or instincts, and how do we transmute that then into development. So there's that sense of destiny kind of being unfolded in front of you when the Rider-Waite magician comes to me. So it's an extremely powerful card, one where this development of one's will, that conscious ego, is really awakening and can take shape around yourself and in your life.
Chris, your thoughts on the Thoth magician?
Sure. So the last time we did the fool, and now we have the individual, the idiot. And I wanted to, just as before we had the little act that allowed us to be like the fool, if everybody, see, I've just done something totally idiotic. I was trying to pick up my cards and they've all flown all over the place. But pick up your deck of cards, pick up your deck of tarot cards, and you are like the magician. You are playing with the full deck. All those tools that he has before him, all the weapons that surround him, those are the cards that we engage with when we use tarot.
So if we examine the Marseille, let's say, as kind of the most straightforward or basic representation of the magician out of these three, the Marseille is kind of, he doesn't appear to be quite as cosmic as in the other lineages. He seems almost like, I think there's some connection to him being sort of like a street magician or even kind of a charlatan in some way, where he's like doing tricks and trying to steal your money in some way. Is that part of the magician as our interpretation symbolically, as not necessarily like a cosmic sorcerer, but like kind of like a charlatan or trickster? What are your thoughts on that, Matt, maybe?
I think that's a really great question and a great observation. A couple of things I will say about this. I'm going to quote a couple different people here. One is Sally Nichols wrote a book about Jung and the tarot, and she differentiated between the fool and the magician as, from this Jungian perspective, the fool plays a trick on you, whereas the magician plays the trick for you. You know, you are the audience. So there is this concept of the entertainer kind of like laying something out for you. And then where that I think gets interesting, I'm going to come back to Tomberg again, who he sort of says that the magician is both an invitation to the work ahead of you of understanding the tarot and a warning. Okay, so if we're looking at this, we're trying to manifest something, this as above, so below. Part of the way that we start to pick up on the magic of reality is to pay attention to synchronicity, to look at the laws of analogy, how one thing is like another, how the swords are like the air and how the wands are like the fire and all this kind of stuff. This is very crucial to understanding how the tarot is. But there's also a tremendous amount of just random noise. And you start to notice that things are like, oh, this is like that, and this is like this, and every event becomes a synchronicity. And what Tomberg is saying is that is the path in which a person walks the path of becoming a charlatan. And he even observes that in a lot of occult philosophy and in interacting with a lot of occultists, those two things, the cosmic sorcerer and the charlatan, exist in the same person. You can read whoever you want to pick, whether it's Blavatsky or Rudolf Steiner or Crowley or whoever, and you find these people and you're like, wow, there's some really deep stuff. And then sometimes but are they just making this shit up? And those things really do coexist in the same time. And I think that that is present there. And Tomberg would say it's present as a warning, is if you are trying to progress in this path and trying to understand these things more deeply. And I mentioned this in my intro, there's a certain amount of work up front that lets you play with the tools that you have. So if you're a musician, the practice that you put into learning your craft pays off in the performance being light, free, and fun. But both of those things have to exist to some extent and in some balance for it to be musical. And in our case, for it to be magical, is that the genuine insights that you get through a sort of disciplined approach to things, let the playfulness and fun of the process have room to breathe. Whereas you can kind of play tricks on yourself and think that you're discovering all sorts of cool stuff without that kind of like, without that sort of like check-in between like, what, is what I'm doing really rooted somewhere.
I think the magician, as we start to like awaken to this sense of power and conscious awareness, that archetype gets you front and center with this sense of manipulation, because inherently the magician is recognizing what are the dynamics that he can work with, what can he manipulate in reality, what can he sort of bring forward in front of people that is illusory in nature. And that ability to manipulate the environment it has a valence to it, right? Like it can be lighter, it could be more positive, it can be for good, but it could also get you into these darker realms where, maybe the manipulation is something, it's like self-manipulation. Or even if you think about a child sort of awakening to their own power, they're pretty trickstery in a way. There's this kind of nature of recognizing what is manipulatable in yourself, in your environment, that allows you to sort of bend the rules in some way or to play tricks on people. And so there's that interesting connection, I think, between the Fool and the magician, as Matt was bringing up, but it's very different. While the Fool's trickery is so much more unconscious to me, the magician has a sense of centeredness and the ability to really focus these tricks, illusions, manipulations, which can be extremely powerful and extremely expansive, but at the same time, can put someone in the situation where they are, you know, maybe abusing power to some degree or being a bit of a charlatan.
I think, you know, we focused a lot on Zero in the last one, and his being number one is really important. The Fool is kind of the ever-present, not just the trickery that is played on us, but the trickery that makes up the world that the magician has to manipulate. And when I say he's an idiot because he's an individual, this is like, it's a joke about what Nietzsche says. You know, he calls Christ an idiot because idiot means individual. That's why Dostoevsky uses idiot. And you get the dual meaning of idiot as individual in the Thoth card in particular. You can see by his feet is the ape of Thoth. The ape of Thoth is the charlatan aspect of the magician. Though they are the same thing, it's, you know, the magician is Thoth in terms of Egypt, Hermes Trismegistus, but the ape of Thoth is also present with Nietzsche, the ape of Zarathustra, who is kind of displayed as somebody who has learned everything that Zarathustra had taught and just spits it out without any understanding, without any real significance to it. So it's definitely a card that is much more predicated on the intentions, the direction of that manipulation. It can just as easily, the same people with the same knowledge with different intentions can go from being, you know, an ape and a fool to being an expert and a effective manipulator.
So I want to touch upon this notion of the magician as consciousness or the ego, how that might relate to the magician kind of as like the hero figure, as in often the heroes in our mythologies are kind of representative of ego consciousness in some sense, and also how that connects maybe with Christ, because I feel like I'm seeing some Christ imagery in the Thoth card. I'm wondering if that's what you see as well, Chris, maybe, because especially the legs crossed over, there's kind of this Christ sort of on the cross imagery I'm picking up on. So how is the magician related to the hero ego consciousness or this Christ figure?
Christ is definitely there. Even symbolically in Marseille, he's got the Technicolor dream coat on, which Jesus wore as well. And that speaks again to what Christ does, what individuals do, which is take on the weight of the world, understand the entire world. And the rainbow, the multicolored, is the very symbol of that. So, you know, it's why the Rosicrucians use the multicolored cross as their symbol. Christ is that universal understanding, is that individual who takes on the entire world. So that is the role of consciousness, but I think it's you know, super consciousness, not the psychological consciousness as one might be used to it, but super consciousness, including unconsciousness, which is, I don't know, sounding charlatan-y because it's difficult to explain, right? How do you, the magician is not just our simple ego conscious minds, but more.
I think that sense of moreness that you're talking about is expressed in the writer Waite by being the conduit that is both present in the material, allowing things to manifest in reality, but also being connected to a higher principle. And what is that higher principle? It's like the unconscious depths, it's God the Father, you know, it's source, energy, whatever you want to call it. There's a feeling that there is a dynamic tension between what is viewable, what is material, what is concrete, and how the magician can work with it or influence or be a part of that story. And also that there's something much more. So that feeling of the flow between the higher and the lower is situated through the conduit body of the magician. And that to me is a very it's a very archetypally Christ story, as well as both like the manifestation of God in the material, and the ability also to kind of shift stories to bring things forward into the world that might have need to be said, but there had to be some sort of conscious material manifestation for that to really happen. So you're getting these complexities of realities, I think, in the magician, and that weight of the world that you talk about. I thought that was really beautiful, because that kind of unconscious aspect of the fool doesn't make him fully aware, at least in a conscious way, in a more egoic way of everything that kind of lays at his feet. But to me, the magician is just this burst of consciousness, but we haven't moved too deep into the dynamics of the major arcana to lose connection to that source. There's still this really dynamic connection that the magician has.
Yeah, and I see that I think in the Marseille there's a few things that kind of cue us into the same way. One, you see this magician's hat has this form of a lemniscate, that kind of figure eight pattern that's really explicitly, so it's kind of incorporated into the symbolism of the Marseille, and then when you see the rider Waite, it's actually just explicitly put out this way. And that's kind of a classic symbol of infinity, and of kind of like going, like the kind of going in and going out and repeating in a cycle that sort of gives us this idea that this is standing outside in some way. And I think that kind of relates to what Chris was saying about the difference between consciousness and just the ego consciousness, and where that comes in the Christ figure, which is very much the tarot, although it's not seen this way in a lot of ways, did evolve in a Christian milieu, and there is a lot of this that's present there, either explicitly or implicitly. And what Christ is, or has been described as, one of the trickiest things that people have to get around is this idea of the incarnation of the infinite into a finite container. And so that manifestation that the magician represents is sort of like, it's the difference between, what some people call this the dice game of Shiva. Like there's the idea that there's consciousness as a overarching thing is what creates all of reality. What we experience as individuals is a little tiny piece of that, but it shares a resemblance and a affinity and an analogy with that as the whole. And so religiously, Christ is where those two things meet, both being fully God and fully man. The magician is also a place where we see those two things meet, between the infinite and the transcendent, and how it differentiates itself into the things that we see and that we experience as individuals.
Just had a funny little point also. In very old depictions of Christ, he had a magic wand. It's outright. And in Christian alchemy, Mercury is identified with Christ as well. So the synthesis of the God form of Mercury as that kind of manipulative but aware force, and a messenger of what is larger, the larger consciousness is present.
It's interesting because the association to the magician from the astrological viewpoint is Mercury. So we're seeing all of these threads of connection with that symbolism of Christ. And then in the alchemical tradition, Mercury is that potent content that is the manipulatable element. It's that kind of patron alchemical Mercurius that kind of watches over the process and allows one to move through that process of transmutation, of taking this kind of base material and working to transform that into something much higher, into gold. And I don't know if you guys have any thoughts in general about the symbolism of Mercury in general, or the association to that, but the magician holding that astrological association, I think, speaks to a lot of the heart and depth of what's going on here, as well as the connection and threads back to Christ figure as well.
On the Thoth specifically, just a thought. I'm seeing Hermes imagery for sure, right? The winged feet, but also the caduceus behind his head. Like that connection is pretty explicit, right? Mercury and Hermes.
Yeah. It's interesting. Maybe you can speak more to that, Chris. But you see the kind of like Hermes influence, and I think we touched a little bit on Hermes a bit with the Fool, but it's very striking with the Thoth deck, both in the Fool card and in the Magus, that you do see these elements of the mercurial dynamics sort of woven through. Any thoughts on that?
I hope you don't mind if I give a brief tangent on my thoughts on Christ and Mercury together. It's actually really, really significant to me. So have I told you guys about randonauting? About randonautica? So randonautica, similar to the tarot, it can be a form of divination, but it's an app that my friend made, and it allows you to kind of go on a little meaningful journey, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's really cool. Check it out. But you use intentions to have interesting experiences. And I used the intention Jesus Christ. And the random location that it brought me to was actually a church. But outside the church, there had been a car accident before. And so there was a piece of a car that was missing. And I'll be back in like 1 second. I got to show you because it's so significant. I'll be back in like just, point one. Peter
Mentioned Randonautica or Random Journal, right? Is the app that sends you on a little journey and brings me. Okay,
what better than
Mercury? Oh, wow. Awesome.
From the type of car Mercury right outside the church. And that was how that connection became so deeply physically real, the connection between Christ and Mercury, and just kind of exploring how Christianity becomes, especially with Protestants, like enervated and boring, because we take the mysticism, we take the tradition away. It is sapped of meaning, for me at least. And Christian alchemy, as Jung explores, it brings brilliance and beauty to the tradition again. And so that is my little sentimental thought about Christ and Mercury.
So first off, I love that. I think it's great. Yeah, and I think it's helpful to remember Mercury is the god of tricksters and thieves. And kind of like Chris was saying, we tend to not look at that aspect of Christ, especially not here in the United States, where we're all located. We don't look at that aspect, but it's there. he spoke to the crowds by means of parables, and they were confused and they didn't know what was going on. And he did things that were deliberately strange, and talked about having people eat his body and his blood, and they just like, what is this guy even talking about? And even on the crucifix, he's there next to a thief, and that's a significant part of the story, and he often offers that person. So there is a long-standing relationship between these things and how these archetypes manifest historically, that I think it's worth thinking about and interacting with and pondering.
I'm curious if we could talk a little bit more about the items on the magician cards. The Marseille's got, some dice and what looks like maybe like a knife and different things. And obviously with the Rider Waite, we're seeing like the items of the minor arcana suit. And that's reflected in Thoth as well. But then you have all these other things like a papyrus and maybe like a pen or things like that. So just to kick off with like the Rider Waite, we see that those elements of the minor arcana being presented for the first time now in the majors. And to me, it's this expression of what tools are really at our disposal when we awaken to this power inside of ourselves, and we can recognize what we can interact with in both the kind of subtle reality, the kind of emotional relational dynamics. Like, how can we work with that? How can we tap into the cups of our emotional depths and the relational connections? And you can start to manipulate the mind with the sword, or you can manipulate the material realm with the pentacles, or your kind of dynamic energy and will with the wand. And so to me, it's like these different layers of experience and potential that the fool, now become the magician, is awakening to. But we see a lot of different items in the other cards. So any thoughts on that, guys?
I'll go ahead. So beyond the ones you described, the ones that are in Rider, you see the cosmic egg, which is, requires a video of its own, but it's essentially infinite potential. And then he has his own magic wand, as the others do. So not just the wand on the table, but his own. But as for how to use it, I think something that is ignored a bit because of how kind of consumerist we've become, how materialist we've become, is that the things that you carry in your day can take on a magical significance. And I think that there's an importance to being aware of the objects that you keep near you. Like, I view even simple things like a pocket knife. A pocket knife can be a sword. A lighter can be a wand. A watch can be a coin. I think even the phone, our cell phones, are cups to an extent, deep reflective surfaces. But just essentially that it's important to keep what is before you very meaningful, and to not let it be nothing.
And you bring up an interesting point, Chris. There's something to be said about the kind of sacred items that you fill your space with. And at times, I think we can become so, as you said, sort of consumerist or materialist focused, that we just have all these things, and maybe we've lost connection to what that actually means to us, or we just consume for the sake of consuming. But what does it mean to intentionally have the items that represent much greater depths? To me, I have my bookcase that has all of these sort of magical items that I like to keep nearby, because there's a sense of symbolism to them, to have them nearby if I'm going to meditate, or even if I'm going to walk around. And the magician is an interesting invitation to consider what are the items that are our companions, almost, in a way. What do we put on our tool belt and how does that represent parts of ourselves, but also like the greater journey that we're on.
Yeah, I think hearing both of you talk about those aspects of things brings up something that a friend of mine, she's been drawing the magician over and over and over again, and it wasn't a card that she had really gotten very often in her practice, but it was starting to come up for her. And I really liked how she was starting to conceptualize it as having everything that you need. And so there's, Chris talked about the intentionality of sort of like setting up your environment so that it gives you what you need. But also the tools and the elements are sort of like always present with everything, because they mirror the structure of reality as we experience it. So there's kind of an interesting idea there of sort of like coming into things with a sort of like stoic acceptance or attitude about what you're encountering, and making the magic out of whatever situation you find yourself in, because it's all there and you have whatever you need. So it's a certain kind of mindset and certain kind of like frame with which it's possible to look at circumstances.
So something I'm wondering about is kind of dualisms in the tarot that can be interesting. And so there's the magician can be compared to the high priestess in some ways, as like conscious versus unconscious, or maybe masculine, feminine. It's not that simple, but also the magician doing the as above, so below thing with his arms. It's also reflected in the devil, right? The devil is doing this same positioning of his arms, as above, so below. And so I'm wondering what the connection is between the magician and the high priestess, and the magician and the devil.
Well, the devil is an interesting, that's an interesting point, and you are right. I'm just gonna like grab it. Maybe people can sort of see here with one arm sort of raised up and one down. And so you are seeing this dynamic similarity in their body. And I think even if you pull where like the kind of source imagery of like the Baphomet, that often his hands are kind of positioned in this way. So you're getting into that occultist Golden Dawn alchemical expression of the as above, so below. And the devil to me is basically like this distortion of the Baphomet. So I think it's both carrying like a very similar credence of the kind of conduit, the ability to kind of manipulate and work with energies. And obviously with the devil, there's like kind of this movement a little bit more towards the negative valence, or when things have become kind of twisted into this darker place, or you've lost maybe conscious control of the things that are now controlling you. So there's that kind of distortion a bit with the devil, but there's still this sense, I think, that there is a really powerful, controlling, manipulating dynamic. And the question is, are you going to be the one who's attempting to work with those tides, or are you going to be the one who's kind of being overrun by it, drowning it even? And I think at times, especially with the Rider-Waite devil, that there's a feeling that you've lost your sense of agency and that awareness, because often the devil to me expresses that the things that are pulling at you, the things that are dragging upon you, are very much in your own control. You just kind of lost the realization, and you need to kind of like take back some of that will and that control. And the magician maybe was the first time that was a really awakening in an individual. And maybe I'll stop there. We can touch on the priestess in a moment, but if anyone else has any thoughts.
I'll talk a bit about the priestess, if that's okay. So I'd heard recently some like pretty misogynistic thoughts on women in Christianity, and just that like women were incapable of being as devoted. And I said, like, that's complete nonsense. The only followers of Christ who followed him to the cross were Mary Magdalene and his mother. They were the only ones who were loyal to the end. And so I think that kind of shows the difference between the magician and the priestess. The priestess is truly devoted to the higher source. The magician would flake when called upon, I think. The magician is far more tricky and is certainly not devoted or fixed in the way that the high priestess is going to be really focused and solid. Even in her being ephemeral, is far more solid and dependable than Mercury and the magician.
Yeah, that like mercurial nature is something that like just slips between the hands, you know, it just shape shifts and it moves out of the way. And especially when I associate the magician as an alchemist, it's like this was a very solitary practice. You know, it's not like they were gathering in groups of alchemists. In fact, everything was you know, spoken through symbol. You know, they were driven underground because they were persecuted, or, you know, it wasn't fully accepted. And so there's this nature of the magician that's illusory and hidden. And that feeling with the priestess to me is like she's ever accessible if we're willing to allow ourselves to sort of sink below into the depths and be connected to this innate power that kind of just exists beyond the veil. But I don't think that she gatekeeps in a way that the magician does. You know, like you've got to really search out the magician or find him in his lair. And even then, you know, maybe with a puff of smoke, he'll be gone. But the priestess is much more grounded as that feminine element, the kind of underground sort of spiritual mother that is always under the surface, even when we don't consciously recognize her.
I look at some of these dichotomies or some of these pairings in a slightly different way. I see those echoes of the magician in the high priestess. I see the echoes that were the perversion, I guess you could say, in the devil. But where I really see a sort of like parody or a polarity, maybe is the better word for it, is between the world and the magician. We have this sort of like initiation into the deck with this very, you know, this, especially in the Rider Waite, is this very masculine figure, which maybe we can talk about it a little bit later, but Chloe had mentioned in the chat that there's a gendered aspect to it. And then as we proceed through the major arcana, where we end up is in the world. And in the, there's Alyssa's holding up the world of the Rider Waite. And we'll see there's some similarities here in that she's holding a wand that looks very much like the wand of the magician. She's actually holding two wands, and there's this femininity or feminine form that she's assuming, and that there's also these symbols that she's surrounded with that are different than the symbols of the elements that the magician is surrounded with, but they are also symbols for the structure of reality. They allude to the symbols of the zodiac. They allude to the four evangelists in the Bible. And this has kind of often been associated with the soul of the world, or the animus mundi. And there's a contrast there, I think, in the beginning of the journey sort of ends as, oh, and one other thing I should say, that these traditional, in the Marseille and the Rider Waite and the Thoth, they have these gendered figures, but there are actually older decks. Some of the old Italian decks portray the world card in a sort of hermaphroditic, or not particularly clear that it's, but there's the elements of the feminine, but it's not clear that it's a woman exactly. And so I think there is this sort of there's a contrast between sort of like beginning with the active principle and sort of arriving at the receptive principle through the journey. And that's really where I see that kind of like bookending of the magician with another card. Although there are certainly aspects, and there are those resonances and synchronicities and not synchronicities, but similarities that are present there. One person even mentioned in the chat, I saw something about the hermit, and they're both holding a wand. There's some similarities to that too. Maybe we can talk about later if we get a chance to.
I was going to agree on the similarity between the world. It's especially pronounced visually in Thoth. You can see, and if you know the deck well, these are the only two like pure golden figures who appear. And I think the way that there's two things. So I'll start though with the elements. So what were tools are now fully forming the world, almost as if, Mercury as just an idea had become a principle. What began as potential directions, the cherubs are now like fully directing and flowing, making the world occur. And then the relationship between Mercury and Saturn, it's described, those two planets are very friendly. And it's because it's Saturn, the old man, and Mercury, the little boy. And they're like, it's described as like, they're like, he's bouncing him on his knee, they're happy. And that's, God and Christ. So you kind of get this image of evolution in the tarot especially. But what was, just a simple idea coming is now fully solidified.
All right, I think we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of the session. We've only got about 9 minutes left. So Loey, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, I think you had a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask it?
Hi, I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit more about the gendered nature of the magician. I know you guys sort of touched on it, but having it be a masculine card feels strange to me considering how generative it is. So I was wondering if you guys could discuss that.
Well, a couple of thoughts. To me, I think of the magician in the masculine principle as that kind of flow of nature that expands. And as it kind of pushes outward and it starts to create structure and it starts to manipulate things. It's not to say that this is male in nature, but rather just a masculine principle of the dynamics of what happens when things come into contact. And the masculine to me really, it manipulates and it contorts and it creates these boundaries, where the feminine is much more of that holding. It's the kind of generative aspect that is the container of life and where things kind of grow and expand and there's this spaciousness. So to me, there's like generative principles both within the masculine and in the feminine, but the masculine to me is much more pointed, like it's much more phallic in nature. It's going to kind of come in and pierce things and distort and shift and change. And I see that in the magician personally. Like, I do think it's about this expanding awareness rather than a contracting inward, because then we move on to card number 2, and it's this much more subtle form of the generative principle with the priestess. It's not so much about manipulating reality, but more so about the holding of the space and the entering into the deep waters of the unconscious. And there's so much generative creativity that's flowing from her. And that's why they kind of exist in that sort of yin and yang element. So those principles of creation and generativity are expressed just through different lenses, I think, with both the magician and other feminine cards as well.
I will terrify you Jungians. In the alternative form of the magician, you can see the wand is his penis. Magic, and you can see this very clearly in Egypt, where masturbation, male masturbation, creates the universe. The magician is like literally playing with his toys. He's playing with his toy. And the hermit, who is also Mercury, is the semen. He is the semen that comes out. He is the seed of creation. So the magician, the magician is masturbating. He's holding his wand, and he is creating. Yes.
Matt, do you have any thoughts on that before we move on?
I did. They're gone. No. Yeah, I guess what I would say is that, yeah, I think for me, it returns back to this idea of the ferment or the enzyme that sparks a change. And again, the masculine principle, at least biologically, is the semen that fertilizes something. So the two things have to exist and coexist together for the generative forms to happen. So that's that a larger part of how the tarot works in general is that there is all of these forces are at work in all of us all the time. And so the masculine forces are at work in us, the feminine forces are at work in us, and we cannot exist in our reality without access to both of these things. Whether that's, and as biological creatures that sexually reproduce, that's very much a part of our life. But even just from a more abstract or from a more archetypical perspective, both of these things, there has to be this this dance between the two. Yeah.
We had a question submitted, and it's from Dave. And he said, how does one move from the realm of the fool to that of the magician?
Sorry.
Go for it, Chris.
Okay. As like my channel, I guess, talks about a lot of problems. So a lot of people with problems will come. And the best advice that I think is possible, and I think it's true here, is you pick a direction and you run in it. The magician is simply the fool, but now there's direction. It's no longer the all. It's no longer that infinite potential. It's now that. That's it.
It's that infinite potential that has shape and form, because we even see, especially with the Marseille and the Rider Waite, that symbolism of the infinity is still there that which sort of generated the Fool in the first place, or what he was in touch with, hasn't been lost. So this step in development and maturation has brought a sense of a structure, and as you said, a direction, and yet there's still a sense that there's a connection to that infinite realm of possibility, which I think in everyday, more mundane life, if we were to really ground this, we lose sight of that. Absolutely. And to me, both the Fool and the Magician are reminders and invitations back to that mindset, that like what you sense as potential can be, what seems like a far off dream can actually manifest into reality. And it's usually by you kind of grasping life and saying, I can work with it, that you really start to move from that place of just potential and ideas into actual action and development.
Yeah, there's Chris in our last discussion had a great image that stayed with me of the Fool as the crust punk, and the perennial outsider. And if I had to think of the Magician, there's still an edge to him, but he's more like this kind of like cleaned up goth guy who's, like there's still like this sexy danger to it, but now he's kind of like, he's gone in, he's taken a shower, he's put on some sparkly vampire clothes, and he's ready to kind of like fly out there. So when I think about, okay, how do you move from the Fool to the Magician? Sometimes it's just kind of a matter of seeing where you are and what do you want to do next. That directionality that Chris talked about is picking a direction and going in it as far as it'll take you. There's an element in a lot of traditional discussions of the Fool of practice. I've mentioned it a few times. Tom Berg talks about it a lot in Meditations in the Tarot, of the work that you kind of do ahead of time. Doesn't disconnect you from creativity and playfulness. It allows it a conduit to come out. So I think that it's just, at the risk of kind of sounding like Jordan Peterson here, if you look around, you will just find a whole bunch of shit that's not quite right in your life. And sometimes it's just a matter of like fixing this one thing right here. And then once you fix that next thing, and fix that next thing, and fix that next thing. And what you're doing in that process is grabbing the tools that are there, grabbing the fundamental elements of your reality and ordering them in the way that you that matches the vision in your mind there.
Thanks, Matt. So we've just reached the end of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and close things up. Thank you, Chris and Matt, for joining us today. If you're interested in checking out their work, MemeAnalysis on YouTube is where you can find Chris, and Matt is over at Spear of Fire Tarot. You can find him on social media. Check out his work. Hopefully we'll be back next month covering another topic, but otherwise you can check out goldenshadow.org. We've got a minor arcana workshop coming up next week on Saturday at 12 o'clock. We'll also be talking to Cadell Lass, exploring the relationship between Freud and Jung. And in early June, we'll be talking to Stefan Fox of the Uber Boyo YouTube channel on Jung's Red Book. So feel free to check out more of our events at goldenshadow.org. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadow.org.
If you'd like to keep up to date with our projects, attend one of our live events, or work one-on-one with myself or Arran, head to www.goldenshadow.org.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.